Welcome to EPG Pathashala. This unit which we are going to do is a part of the module Advanced Syntax. The unit itself has the title The Theory of Government and Binding. Okay? Let me introduce myself. I am Professor Jayashilan. I am a retired professor of the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, and I have been teaching syntax, I suppose, for nearly 30 or 40 years. Okay, and those of you who are familiar with Chomskyan linguistics will know that after the transformational grammar revolution took place in the world of linguistics in the late 1950s and the 1960s. The biggest advance in syntax of generative grammar was the introduction of the theory of government and binding. This theory was unveiled by Chomsky in a book titled Lectures on Government and Binding, which came out in 1981. Although the ideas were earlier presented by him at a conference called the GLOW Conference in Pisa in 1978. What does the theory of government and binding do? Why is it considered so important? Many people say that the government and binding theory, often referred to informally by the short name GB, was the real break with traditional grammar. Okay, and if you ask someone what did it do, it is difficult to say it in a brief way, but I'll attempt to say it in one sentence. What the government and binding theory did was to eliminate rules of grammar. You know, the traditional grammar had a number of grammar rules. For example, the passive transformation. The passive transformation moves the direct object of the sentence into the subject position, and the subject itself is demoted into the object of a by phrase, a prepositional phrase, or it's even omitted. And those who did early transformational grammar will know how the passive transformation was formulated. Okay, and there are the rules like relativization, which tells you how to form a relative clause. For example, the man whom you saw. Question formation, for example, the transformation which tells you how to form the question, whom did you see? The transformation of topicalization, which tells you how to get a topicalized sentence like, this picture I like. From the underlying structure, I like this picture. You move this picture, the direct object, to the beginning of the sentence, and you get this picture I like, which is topicalization, comparative formation, clefting, etc., etc. There are any number of rules of grammar which traditional grammar talks about. Now, the way these rules were stated, formulated in traditional grammar, the rules had nothing in common. Each rule was different from the others. There was no way in which you could generalize across them. And very importantly, the rules were language particular. Their language particular means there is one rule which is stated for the English passive construction. There is another rule which is stated for the Hindi passive construction, for the Japanese passive construction, etc., etc. So the rules for each language were formulated differently, and there was no way in which we could generalize across them. Therefore, we were faced with a number of rules of grammar which each different from the other within the same language, and each different from the corresponding rule in other languages. Now think of what this would mean for a child learning its mother tongue. We are assuming that the child is trying to internalize the grammar of its mother tongue. Okay? If each rule was different from the other, a child learning its mother tongue would have to acquire each rule of grammar separately, rule by rule. This should take a long time, because as we know, linguists have taken years to formulate the rules of grammar, the passive, question formation, relativization, etc. And therefore we would predict that each child would take a number of years to learn its mother tongue. But this is just not true. As we know, children learn their first language easily and rapidly, and with uniformity across children. Therefore, this picture of grammar, of what grammar consists of, just cannot be right. This grammar must actually be exceedingly simple, if only we understood it right. There must be, in other words, there must be an extremely simple universal grammar which the child is born with. In his attempt to arrive at this extremely simple universal grammar, Chomsky took certain steps, but some of these steps were actually prepared for much earlier, not as late as 1981 when the book came out. The groundwork for this leap was prepared by a dissertation done at MIT by a linguist called John Robert Ross. He wrote this dissertation in 1967. The title of the dissertation was Constraints on Variables in Syntax. And what John Ross did was to study the so-called long distance rules. That is, rules which move a phrase across a long distance. For example, question formation. I can ask a very simple question. What did you see? What did you see? Where I move the word what from the object position of see to the beginning of the sentence that we now call the comp position. Okay? Now in this particular example, there is only one clause. What did you see? But the movement can be longer. For example, I can say, what did you say that you saw? Then the movement is longer. I can say, what did you say that Peter believes that you saw? The movement is still longer. What did you say that Peter believes that John claims that you saw? Then the movement is much longer. Theoretically, the movement of the WH phrase what can be infinitely long. Similarly, look at the transformation called relativization. Take a simple case of relativization, the man whom I saw, where whom is moved from the object position of saw. But this whom can be moved from much farther away. For example, I can say the man whom I said that I saw, and it is a longer movement. I can say the man whom I said that Peter believes that I saw. It's a longer distance. The man whom I believe that Peter says that John claims that I saw. This is a longer distance. Again, the movement can be infinitely long. The same can be said about topicalization. The book that I read. The book that you say that I read. The book that you say that everyone believes that I read. You can go on lengthening the sentence such that the displaced phrase and the place it is displaced from is farther and farther apart. There are other long distance rules. There are about 10 long distance rules in English: clefting, comparative formation, etc., etc. I won't go into all of them. Now, what Robert Ross did in his dissertation was to study certain properties of these long distance rules. And he found that there were certain syntactic configurations from within which a phrase could not be moved out. These syntactic configurations, he called them islands. And these constraints came to be called island constraints. Sometimes they are also referred to as Ross constraints. The most well-known Ross constraint or island constraint is the complex NP constraint. A complex NP is an NP which contains a clause. For example, take a simple NP like a picture. If I have a relative clause inside it, a picture which you showed to Mary, is a relative clause which is inside the NP, a picture which you showed to Mary. I can have a simple noun phrase like the claim, but I can have a sentence inside it, the claim that John loves Mary. Okay, so there can be clauses embedded within NPs, and that is a certain configuration, and nothing can be moved from within the clause outside. For example, I saw the picture which you showed to Mary is a good sentence. I saw the picture which you showed to Mary, where the object is the picture which you showed to Mary, and that NP, the picture, has a relative clause inside it which you showed to Mary. Now you try to move anything out of that clause, say the picture which you showed to whom, and try to move whom to the beginning of the sentence. Whom did you see the picture which you showed to? This is an abominably bad sentence, and that is because you are extracting a phrase from within an island, the complex NP. Okay, another island is the WH island. A WH island goes like this: an embedded clause which has a WH phrase in its comp acts like an island. That is, for example, I can ask a question like, I asked her what she saw. What she saw is an embedded clause which has what in its comp position. And now if I try to move something out of that configuration, for example, I suppose I start with the sentence, I asked her what, who saw, and I try to move that. Who did you ask her what saw is a very bad sentence, because you are moving a phrase from within an island, namely a WH island. Now Ross discovered in his thesis about 9 or 10 syntactic configurations which disallowed extraction from within them. That means he discovered some 10 islands for extraction. Okay. Now, when these islands were looked at, what was interesting was that these island constraints applied equally to all the long distance rules of the language. Now that presented a theoretical problem, because in traditional grammar, rules like question formation, relativization, topicalization, etc., these were formulated as separate different rules. So if there are 10 long distance rules, you had 10 formulations. Now if you want to say that, express the fact that the island constraints apply to all the 10 long distance rules, you have to state the island constraints individually for each long distance rule. But this is obviously uneconomical. We are obviously missing a generalization. So there was a theoretical problem presented by the work of John Robert Ross that remained unsolved for a number of years. And what Chomsky did in the book, when he formulated GB, was to propose a solution. He said that all the long distance rules are actually one rule. They are all underlyingly the movement of a WH element. That's like a WH element is like something like what or whom or where or why or etc. Okay, in English. For example, this is obvious in certain cases. For example, in the case of question formation, there is a WH phrase moved to the beginning of the clause. It is also obvious in the case of relativization, the man whom you saw, whom is moved. It is less obvious in certain cases, but it can be shown by data from different languages that these all involve the movement of a WH element. And therefore Chomsky said these rules can be stated as one rule, namely move WH. Similarly, take the traditional grammar rules, passive and raising. The passive transformation, which moves the direct object to the subject position. Take the active sentence, John kissed Mary, Mary was kissed. That is the passive transformation. There is another rule, traditional grammar rule, the raising of the subject of an embedded clause to the subject position of the matrix clause. For example, it seems that John is nice. It seems that John is nice. The embedded clause subject is John. That John is nice. Okay. But if you have that John is nice is a finite clause, But if you have a non-finite clause there, it seems John to be nice. John has to move to the matrix position, subject position. John seems to be nice. So in both passive and raising, you have the movement of an NP. In the case of the passive, the direct object is moved to subject position. In the case of raising, the subject of the embedded clause is moved into the subject position of the matrix clause. But both these, Chomsky said, are actually one rule, and this can be formulated as move NP. So all long distance rules were reduced to move WH, and passive and raising were reduced to move NP. Now what Chomsky did was he collapsed these two rules, namely move WH and move NP, and formulated it in the extremely abstract form move alpha. Alpha here stands for any phrase, and move alpha does not tell you where it should be moved from or where it should be moved to. Therefore, move alpha simply tells you move anything from anywhere to anywhere. Move anything from anywhere to anywhere. At this level of abstraction, you can hardly call it a rule of grammar. Some critic would say this is a license for chaos, because if you move things around obeying move alpha, then you are bound to generate a whole number of a very large body of ungrammatical sentences. So how do we deal with this? That is the task of GB. That is, it formulates principles which control the overgeneration created by the rule move alpha. That is, any illicit, illegitimate application of move alpha can be shown to violate a principle. Okay? So, but keep in mind that now we are working with a theory in GB where there is only one transformational rule, move alpha, and all the rules of grammar have been eliminated. What are the general principles of UG? Okay? And what the government binding theory does is to propose a set of universal principles which apply to the output of move alpha. So what we did in this unit was to introduce you to the government binding theory, or GB theory as many people call it. We gave you the essentials of it, the outline of it, and what the outline said was that Chomsky reduced the rules of traditional grammar to one rule, namely move alpha, and then proposed in GB general principles which the child is presumably born with knowledge of, which will control the overgeneration that will be caused by move alpha.